The war beyond our eastern border is entering a phase of stagnation and no progress, with no clear advantage for either side. Armed clashes have stalled in many places, and the front line remains virtually unchanged. The Ukrainian counteroffensive was supposed to push the Russians out of Ukrainian territory at a much faster pace, but it turned out not to be as simple as it seemed. The 5-month Ukrainian counteroffensive moved the front line by 17 km. The Ukrainians made a mistake in assuming that dramatic losses would force the Russian authorities to make concessions. However, the Kremlin is not paying attention to the piles of corpses. Additionally, the passage of time may work in their favor. Just a few days ago, it was uncertain whether the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south could be considered over. Ukrainian forces attacked Russian positions where the situation seemed most promising, under Robotin. A large number of heavy equipment was introduced into the battle, including Western tanks and armored personnel carriers. The Russians withstood the pressure, and then the intensity of the exchange of fire significantly decreased. Currently, the Ukrainian armed forces are still conducting active operations in Zaporozhye, but on a very limited scale. Their goal is not to continue pushing towards the coast of the Sea of Azov. Now it's mainly about harassing the opponent, engaging his potential and reserves, and making minor corrections in the course of the front line to have better defensive positions and be ready to possibly carry out further offensive operations. Ultimately, any doubts about the end of offensive actions were dispelled by the commander of the Ukrainian army. In a Wednesday interview for the British magazine The Economist, General Valery Zalozny admitted that the war has reached a stalemate. The conflict has become positional, and currently Ukraine has no possibility to change this situation. Does this mean that the Ukrainian armed forces have suffered a defeat? What does this way of fighting, reminiscent of the times of the First World War, mean for the Ukrainian army and state? Can the Russians already prepare for victory? We do not have access to Ukrainian planning documents regarding military operations. However, based on public declarations, mainly politicians and analysis of actions taken, it seems reasonable to conclude that the goal of the offensive in the south was to cut off the Russian land corridor, connecting the occupied Donbass with Crimea. Along with other operations such as strikes on military infrastructure, the Black Sea Fleet and the interruption of the Crimean crossing, such a move could lead to the isolation of the peninsula. In the longer term, this could force Russia to abandon Crimea. However, with such ambitious goals, 5 months of effort ending only in moving the front line by 17 kilometers, and that on a relatively small section of the contact of troops, inclined to assess that the counteroffensive can definitely be considered unsuccessful. However, one should look at the broader context. It is constituted by the brilliant Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv and the exhausting, though relatively short and victorious campaign in Cherkasy, which took place last year. It is from this period of summer and autumn of last year that the conviction comes from that, in the fight for independence and borders of Ukraine, quick and spectacular turns of action are possible, all the more so if you use Western heavy equipment, which has become the object of admiration for many observers of the conflict. The war in Ukraine confirmed that Western military technology is of a higher class than Russian, but even it is not a miracle weapon. What's more, when used on a limited scale, both the quantity and variety of supplies that Ukraine could and can count on should be taken into account. With a hasty training of the crew and service, it loses some of its values. The Ukrainians fought in Zaporozhye without air superiority. It is worth noting, however, that it is in the full ecosystem, encompassing all necessary types of weapons. Individual types of armament reveal the fullness of their possibilities. The decision to provide Ukraine with F-16 aircraft was made after the start of the offensive, and the process of delivering them will take many more months. Perhaps it would have been worth waiting, especially since the direction of the Ukrainian offensive was predictable and the Russians had time to prepare. However, additional time used by the Ukrainians to build up potential could also work in favor of the Russians, who could anchor themselves even more in Zaporozhye. Ultimately, they are trying to do this anyway, although to a lesser extent than would be possible if it were not necessary to engage people and resources to maintain defensive positions. It is difficult to assess whether a later moment could have been easier. However, it is worth paying attention to the way the Ukrainians conducted the fighting in the south. There is no certainty at what point the generals of the Ukrainian armed forces concluded that a quick offensive to the sea is no longer realistic. Probably this became clear after several hours of fighting. Much indicates that a strategy of heavy fighting was chosen then, without a specific territorial conquest, conducted with the hope that at some point the Russian defense will collapse. For this purpose, the Ukrainians used their advantage in an extremely effective way, more accurate and far-reaching artillery. In Zaporozhye, several Russian divisions were spectacularly worked out, including key elements of the elite land units of the Russian Federation. However, the Ukrainians made a mistake in assuming that dramatic losses would force the Russian authorities to make concessions. It was my mistake, I admit General Zaluzhny in an interview for The Economist. Russia has at least 150,000 fatalities in the entire war. In any other country, such a number of victims would stop military operations, he noted. This is a key issue. In the Kremlin, they do not care about piles of corpses. In recent days, this can be seen under Adizhia, where the Russians are suffering terrifying losses, and the generals do not resign, pushing further waves into bloody assaults. Looking from the perspective of the Ukrainians, even the mass killing of Russian soldiers, even if it is continuous, is too little. Russia has doubled the size of its contingent in Ukraine, which currently stands at 400,000 soldiers. And this number is constantly maintained. This is a large enough force to conduct limited offensive operations and focus on defending current gains. However, it is not enough to carry out large offensive operations, such as an attempt to occupy Kiev or Kharkov, and to carry out a powerful strike that would break the Ukrainian front in the east. The current course of the war does not meet the ambitions of the Kremlin, which before February 24, 2022, assumed the conquest of all of Ukraine. However, as the saying goes, the head of the country as the matter stands. Theoretically, Moscow still has resources to carry out extensive mobilization and try to operate with an army 2 or 3 times larger than currently, putting everything on one card. Nevertheless, a one-time mobilization of over 1 million men could cause social unrest, which Putin wants to avoid. Although 3/4 of Russia accepts the war, despite the growing awareness of the victims suffered, this attitude does not have patriotic sacrifice. We are dealing with the phenomenon of uneven burdening of conflict costs. The greatest losses are borne primarily by the province, which is usually ethnically different, traditionally deprived of influence in power and social respect. Such losses are willing to bear White Russians for a long time. Escalation, understood as an attempt to occupy larger areas of Ukraine, would inevitably be associated with the bleeding of the European and metropolitan reserve of the Russian army. At the same time, it is difficult to end the war because the legitimacy of Putin and his entourage is based on the conviction of citizens about the brutal but effective power. If the authorities lose in the conflict, they become ineffective and lose the right to rule. Therefore, the conflict must continue, but it must have a socially acceptable scope. From time to time, it is also necessary to announce some victory to maintain the appearance that the situation is not getting out of control. That's why the Russians launched an assault on Bakhmut, and that's why the Kremlin needs to occupy Avdiivka. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that the Russian authorities have given up their original ambitions. In the long term, positional warfare benefits the Russians more. They have a demographic advantage and larger mobilization reserves. There are over 140 million people living in Russia, while in Ukraine there are about 37 million. The Russian economy has not been physically destroyed, and the country still has significant foreign exchange reserves. It still benefits from the rent of the fallen Soviet Union and the legacy of the great army of this country. Although the warehouses are quickly emptying and the condition and age of the equipment leave much to be desired, the force of mass has an impact. To destroy it, the Ukrainians have to sacrifice their own limited resources, which they collect thanks to external support. Without this support, Ukraine, with its weakened economy, could not survive for long. This is the main hope of Russia, which assumes that the protracted positional war will eventually discourage the West from supporting Kiev. As a result, weakened Ukraine could agree to far-reaching concessions. Isn't this an obvious assumption? Only if the United States and other allies persist in their decision to support Kiev. However, they must provide such support with appropriate parameters so that the Ukrainian army gains a clear technological advantage over the Russian one. Then quality can defeat quantity. Bartłomiej Małczyk, an expert, notes that General Zaluzhny, seeing the failure, demanded a halt to the offensive. However, it is worth looking at the political aspect of this event. The highest Ukrainian authorities throughout this period declared that they needed more resources to conduct the offensive. Therefore, an unpopular question arises. Who is responsible for the failure? Soldiers or politicians? In the opinion of the expert, the main responsibility lies primarily on the side of politicians. The unsuccessful Ukrainian counteroffensive is the result of the negative impact of actions. Bartłomiej Małczyk, a graduate of the Theresian Military Academy and an analyst of the war in Ukraine, who appeared on the air of the political channel, analyzed the events on the front in recent months. In his opinion, the Ukrainian military made many mistakes already at the planning stage of the offensive, which ultimately led to defeat. According to Małczyk, the strike in the south failed because the Russians had too much time to prepare the terrain. They also had well-recognized Ukrainian positions, possible axes of friction, and solid defensive fortifications, which were built like permanent fortifications, including the use of reinforced concrete. The expert points out that the second mistake was to divide the directions of the strike to the south, towards Melitopol and towards Bakhmut. In his opinion, it would have been much easier to carry out one strike on Bakhmut, as the fighting for the city had recently ended there, and the Russian side did not have time to properly prepare the area of the city for defense. The strike in both directions significantly weakened the offensive capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. According to the expert, in recent months, internal problems of the Ukrainian army have also become increasingly visible. It is about the loss of the most experienced soldiers who underwent training in the West before the start of the war. The expert draws attention to another factor, which in the opinion of many people is often omitted in this, namely the exhaustion of the staff. Officers who received training from NATO troops after 2014 either do not live or are seriously injured and cannot participate in the fight. They are replaced by people from the reserve who underwent training still in Soviet times. New soldiers apply the tactics they were taught, that is, they fight in a way similar to the Russians. This can be seen in relation to the number of casualties, the expert notes. Bartłomiej Małczyk emphasizes that the forced rotation among the commanders led to a departure from the effective way of conducting the fight. According to him, the counteroffensive should have been stopped after 3, at most 4 weeks of fighting. If the offensive lasts longer, it is no longer an offensive, but a war of attrition. An effective strike involves quickly breaking the front and entering the enemy's rear. However, this did not succeed to the extent that the Ukrainians did not achieve to a large extent, even the first line of defense of the Russian troops. They mainly bled on the field, says the expert. According to the expert, summarizing the over 5-month offensive, voices suggesting that the highest authorities in Kiev had an influence on the actions are increasingly heard. One of the people who particularly pressured the generals was President Volodymyr Zelensky. The expert expresses the opinion that General Zaluzhny, seeing the failure, demanded a halt to the offensive. However, one should look at the political aspect. Throughout this period, the highest Ukrainian authorities said that they needed more resources to conduct the offensive. Therefore, a very unpopular question arises: who is to blame, soldiers or politicians? In the expert's opinion, in this case, primarily politicians. This is also visible in the trust rankings of Volodymyr Zelensky. The president himself, among the soldiers present on the front line, is not, to put it mildly, particularly popular. He believes. The expert emphasizes that the unsuccessful offensive may already be the third battle that the Ukrainians lost due to excessive involvement of politicians in the strategy of fighting. The defense of Bakhmut was completely unnecessary from a military point of view. A so-called stubborn defense was carried out, which would make sense if it was preceded by a counteroffensive. That is, after the city was taken, an offensive was to follow, which in a sense happened. But it should have been organized on a much larger scale. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, whether, despite the lack of significant successes, it is an impulse showing that Ukraine is able to fight bravely. Or maybe due to large losses, it should have been stopped long ago. If you appreciate my work and you like the material, please leave a thumbs up. See you in the next material.